From Hong Kong, the increasingly gruesome attacks by radical protesters are finally catching the eye of their defenders in the West and sparking criticism. From setting alight an ordinary resident to pummeling an elderly man, from hurling petrol bombs to firing flaming arrows, these images are costing the movement the sympathy of various international media and even Western governments. As admitted by one of the spokespersons for the protest movement on German TV, there are different attitudes as to what to do about the use of violence. What sort of split has emerged within the movement as members of the movement resort to violence almost without restraint? Is the movement falling apart? Joining me for the discussion from our Beijing studio is Wang, a reporter with the Global Times, and from Hong Kong, Witman, a deputy to China's National People's Congress. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So when it comes to covering the Hong Kong crisis, the Western media, the foreign media, is probably the greatest influencer on international public opinion. Yet, as I said, now we're seeing more international media outlets exposing the violence perpetrated by extremists in the streets of Hong Kong. Mr. Horn, why do you think these media are now highlighting this reality more and more?
Well, first of all, it is reality. So it's happening, you know, clear and dear and, you know, everywhere and at every moment. So it's very hard not to catch them. You know, when you said there was a split of opinion on the, you know, is there a restraint in use of violence, I couldn't help but wonder, you know, wouldn't violence should be zero tolerated? You know, in my opinion, I think there shouldn't be like a degree of violence or whatever. We should be zero. Here in Hong Kong, we are facing, you know, since Monday, we're having all this forced strike. You know, so you know, when people when the protesters they said they want strike, they stop people from going to work. Okay, they block roads. They throw petrol bombs to trains. They burned cross-harbor tunnels. To me, in any measure, that is just beyond imagination.
It is true. I mean, if you think about it, after 5 months, it seems that our tolerance for violence, you know, just by seeing it, watching it on TV or in our phone, has also gone up. You know, after a while, it seems like, okay, it seems to be the reality. So long as it doesn't hit me, it seems to be acceptable. But again, as the level of violence is going up, you know, if you somber up and really look at the images, some of it has been appalling. For instance, the setting on fire of a ordinary resident, you know, an unarmed man who is just trying to reason with the protesters. It's somber, very sombering. So, Wang, you have been reporting in Hong Kong. You've been there a couple of times. You just returned from the streets of Hong Kong. Do you think these kind of images are eventually waking up the senses of some people in the international public opinion arenas?
I think so, yes. That's the hope. That's what we've been talking about since the start, that if this continues, then they will show the true color of what they are. And what they are is a mob of protesters who have been described as pro-democracy, but whatever they ask, their demands, if you look at them, they're not pro-democracy. So eventually that's what we had believed, and then now we're seeing some change of tones out of London, out of Washington, maybe, if they're still a little bit fuzzy, a little bit not very clear in their condemnation of this violence, but we do see a clear change of a clear shift of tone towards this violence. And I think it's little, though it's a positive sign, it's still appalling to take them this long, 5 months. You just mentioned that it is tiring and, you know, frustrating to watch from phone. Think about, you know, imagine living through it. So people in Hong Kong, I think ordinary people, the so-called silent majority, now really sees these true colors, and that these people are not here to seek, you know, reasonable demands. They're here to just vandalize things and trying to stop Hong Kong from working. So I think eventually we hope that more people will speak up against this, because this is not in anybody's interest. Not in, yeah.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned, well, for several months, you mentioned some foreign governments, it took them several months until they speak up more clearly, for instance, and sending more unquestionable message about the use of violence. For instance, UK officials spoke out initially in support, in sympathy of street protesters. But in August, for instance, the Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab angered China, actually, when he called for an independent investigation of Hong Kong police violence. And yet, 2 weeks ago, Raab himself felt compelled to speak out against the violence. And this is the exact wording of what he said. He said, while the overwhelming majority of protesters have been lawful and peaceful, the UK has always been clear that the violence of a hardcore minority cannot be condoned. Mr. Horn, why do you think the British Foreign Secretary sent out this message? What message do you think that is sending to the movement and, you know, to anybody who's watching what's unfolding on the streets of Hong Kong?
Well, I don't know the reason, but I suspect every government has to face their own people. Okay, with more and more news of what's really happening in Hong Kong being broadcast, I mean, as a responsible government, they have to think, if the UK government supports such vandalizing, such violences, what happens if it happens in their, you know, home country? Will they, you know, use the same kind of tolerance the Hong Kong police have been doing? Would they encourage the same kind of violence and setting up fires and vandalizing properties and burning of banks? I doubt that. I think that is probably, obviously I do not know the real reason, but that's probably one of the reasons they are trying. But, you know, somehow, even in his own wording, I think there is some misleading. There is no vast majority of peaceful, you know, demonstrators and protesters anymore. You do not see them. Each day, you know, the crowd is not big. They're just violent. Okay, I was there yesterday at Central. Okay, yes, you see people blocking roads, throwing bricks. You see even some, you know, peaceful standby people applauding them, but the whole total number of people, I suspect, is definitely less than 1,000 people.
So do you agree to this kind of assessment that this movement, because of the losing support, you know, not just from outside, but also from within the Hong Kong society, and by the way, the condemnation also come from the United States, although they also condemned the possible violence used by police. It says actually on Monday that the United States condemned unjustifiable use of deadly force, and that's and urged police and civilians alike to de-escalate the situation. So there is a message as well to the protesters. But then, as I said, also people from other parts of the Hong Kong society, for instance, the Law Society of Hong Kong, saying, you know, the Law Society condemns all forms of unlawful violence, particularly the use of petrol bombs against the police, as well as apparent attacks on the families of the police officers and bullying of their children at school. So, Mr. Hong, do you think that because of the dwindling outside support and domestic, you know, local people support, this movement is eventually going to fall apart? Or is falling apart? Well,
I remain hopeful, but I am not that optimistic. At the end of the day, unlawful behaviors need to be stopped by law enforcement agencies. Until this very moment, I am not seeing enough law enforcement, well, in terms of ability and willingness. I do not understand the reason behind, but, you know, if you look at the so-called deadly violence or force that used by police, 2 days ago when a police officer, actually a traffic police officer, shot a person who was attempting to, you know, rob his gun. Okay, you can see very clearly from the video there were 3 persons attacking the police officer. One of them was trying to get his gun.
Okay, so yeah, we saw that video, actually very clear. But again, we probably won't have the time to play this excerpt from a interview with one of the spokespeople of the so-called movement on German TV by a very experienced journalist, where she admitted that they are not comfortable with the violence used, but again, to maintain certain unity, they're not going to publicly denounce violence. So you can tell there are different opinions within the group. And Mr. Wang, I want to go to you there. Although from outside action, such as action taken by the police, it is difficult to contain the violence, but nevertheless, is the movement showing a kind of disorganization, different opinions, and ultimately also a lack of political plan, to go back to negotiation, to find some kind of compromise? You can't really burn and destroy Hong Kong to achieve the political goals you want to achieve.
Yeah, so I've seen a little more positive and optimistic path with regard to this, because I think from the start we also say that there are outside forces who are supporting this violence on the street, and then there are a lot of people asking for proof, and then we often pointed to the support from Washington, from London. These are the things that fueling the violence on the street. Now we're seeing that, so then if more and more people condemn that, they lose their international support, then people would think twice. And then, however, from the inside, there are different fractions within the so-called movement. There are people who are against the violence, but the others who are just there to vandalize for the sake of vandalize. So then now they're subscribed to this gangster loyalty rule that they cannot, even if they disagree with people within the movement, they cannot denounce that. However, if this continues, if this pressure continues, and if they lose the support, I imagine that they would ultimately fall apart, and they are actually falling apart from what I can see.
From within.
That's
yeah,
right.
Okay, Mr. Hon, your observation on the situation?
It is, the support is definitely decreasing, in general public, and even some of the media was, also suffering from violence when reporters get attacked. But still, I do not see the movement dying down very soon. There's still a certain support, and also, as I said again, those people who are in the front, who are performing such unlawful acts of vandalizing and violence, they need to be contained and stopped by law enforcement. They cannot be stopped just by other people criticizing them.
Okay, so it seems that the law enforcement has to do a stronger job, a tougher job, let's say.
Yeah, definitely, if I may. For example, the difficulty for the Hong Kong police to carry out more effective measures is because of the resistance from, the criticism from within many people in Hong Kong and from the international community.
I mean, the United States Congress, the United States Congress is poised to pass this legislation, right, to sanction anybody who dares to do anything that's, not in the interest of the United States. At least that's what. So with that kind of pressure, Mr. Hong, very briefly, with that kind of pressure, does it look like anytime soon, without going to any extra lengths, can the police do any better job of containing the situation?
They can. They have the ability. I think it's the willingness, not from them, maybe from higher than them, the willingness to actually execute and maintain the law and order.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to my guest, Wang Cong, a reporter with Global Times, and from Hong Kong, Witman, a deputy to the National People's Congress.